So reports are coming in that the Bulls are now being viewed as a threat to land Christian Wood, who as of right now is probably the best available free agent on the market. And while I don't deny that this report is true, and I'm sure the Bulls are keeping a close eye on the situation, I can't help but think there is just no possible way the Bulls would be willing to go into the luxury tax for Christian Wood. I just don't see it based on the history of this team, and in order for the Bulls to actually sign Wood, they would most certainly have to go into the tax by using the $10.2 million disabled player exception from Lonzo Ball, whether it be all of it or just a portion of it. Not only that, but what you'd have to think is there are going to be some competing teams that could offer Wood more of a prominent role and a better situation from a fit perspective, as well as a chance to contend. But either way, in this video, we'll be talking about whether or not the Bulls would actually be able to acquire Christian Wood, how he would fit on the roster, and what I think will ultimately happen. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now, I know we've talked about the mechanics of the salary cap, the luxury tax, the disabled player exception quite a bit recently, and if it's confusing to you at times, well, that's because it is, and it's what makes transactions like this in the NBA very nuanced and much more complicated. But the best way I can describe it, and again, I am by no means a cap expert, but as of right now, the Bulls have about $156.1 million guaranteed on their books for next season, which is already over the cap by around $20 million. They have been over the cap for a while, really, to start the offseason. And that $156 million does not include Dosunmu, because while the Bulls have extended him the qualifying offer of $5.2 million, he hasn't signed it yet. Now, the luxury tax line for this upcoming season is around $165 million, meaning if you have more than that on your payroll, you have to pay an additional tax as an owner, which Bulls ownership never wants to do. So without Ayo, the Bulls are about $9 million below the tax line. Now, the Bulls have been granted the disabled player exception of half of Lonzo's salary, which comes in at $10.2 million. The exception can be used for a one-year deal, and it obviously does count towards your overall cap sheet and subject to the tax should it go over. And for the Bulls, $9 million below the tax line, using the full disabled player exception would put them over the tax. Now, you add Ayo into that, because as I said in my last video, I do think Ayo will ultimately sign his qualifying offer with money drying up around the league and it being unlikely for Ayo to get more than $5 million a year at this point. So you add Dosunmu, and the Bulls have around $3.3 million now in tax base, which would mean, assuming they would want to go after Christian Wood, the most they could offer him is around $3 million on a one-year deal by using part of the disabled player exception. And say what you will about Christian Wood, he's certainly a flawed player, bit of an empty stats guy, but he is worth more than a $3 million one-year deal. I've seen some people say he's really only going to be worth the veteran minimum at this point, but on what grounds? Yes, he's not in a good position right now because of the fact that there aren't a lot of teams out there that could offer him a sizable contract, but he's 27, in his prime. He's a big that can space the floor, which is sought after in the skill set in today's NBA. He shot 37% from 3 last year and over 4 attempts per game. The year before that, 39% on 5 attempts. He's actually also a solid rebounder. He averaged 7.3 rebounds per game in 25 minutes of play. Good finisher around the rim as well. Yeah, he's not the best when it comes to his overall defense, although he is a decent enough shot blocker, but I wouldn't consider him to be a rim protector by any means. And yes, as a player, he can be very streaky at times, but he's absolutely still worth more than the vet minimum at this stage in his career, and even in this free agency environment where teams have spent the bulk of their money, and I would argue that he's worth more than a one-year $3 million contract. Now, how much is he worth exactly? Well, while Wood, based on his production, his age, his skill set of being a stretch big, is probably worth closer to the full mid-level exception of around $12.2 million, potentially even more than that, but that might be stretching it. While he is worth that much though, his value has significantly diminished just simply by how long he's remained on the free agent market. The fact that virtually no team can offer him the full mid-level exception, and the fact that virtually no team can offer him the full mid-level exception, and also the fact that there aren't a lot of teams out there that can give a prominent role for him. But even despite all of that, I do think Wood could command at least $5 million, which he could obtain from a team like the Lakers who are interested in him, or the Miami Heat who have been linked to Christian Wood as well. It's also not out of the question that the Mavs could re-sign him for a small one-year deal, even though I think that's probably unlikely. And then of course, there are those teams that have a little bit of cap space, depending on whether they renounce the rights to certain players or waive players. Teams like the Pistons, Hornets, the Magic, the Pacers. Again, it's not going to be much, but you'd have to think it's going to be over $5 million for teams that still have some of their mid-level exception to utilize. Now, there are a handful of ways where it could work for the Bulls to be able to sign Christian Wood. One being a sign and trade of some kind, whether that could potentially include Io and signing him to a longer-term deal and trading him to the Mavs in exchange for Wood, which would allow the Bulls to still remain under the tax. It could also be a sign and trade of some other kind where the Bulls could shed a little salary by sending out contracts that enable them to stay just below the tax line, or again, Io doesn't pick up his qualifying offer, he signs with another team, the Bulls don't match, Io leaves for nothing, which I really hope doesn't happen, but if it did happen, it would give the Bulls about $9 million to spend before going into the tax, which they could use a portion of that on Wood, and then 2 vet min deals to fill out the rest of the roster. The question still remains though, do the Bulls want to use their disabled player exception on a guy like Christian Wood? Would they rather just wait it out and see how the season goes and then decide if they want to use it in season should the team be doing well? And maybe then they're going to be more willing to pay the tax. How much would they have to offer Wood to make it enticing enough for him to want to come to Chicago over what other teams are able to offer him? And also, what is his role going to look like? Because you have to remember, for a player like Christian Wood, a player that's in his prime, can shoot over 37% from 3 and can put up 17 and 8 easily, he's looking for an opportunity to gain his value back across the league, looking for more exposure and getting a bigger contract after that. If he goes to a team that might be able to offer him more money but less minutes, that may end up not being as desirable for him compared to a team that offers him a lower annual salary but a more prominent role on a winning team. The Lakers, as an example, they need bigs. There is a world where Wood could potentially start or feature to be a 6th man on that roster. And it's a team that just went to the conference finals. A role on that kind of team in that market could secure Christian Wood a much bigger payday down the line. And so I say all this because even if the Bulls somehow were able to make the money work, where they didn't have to go into the tax and they were able to offer Wood more money than the rest of the teams around the league, you have to think about this from Wood's perspective and the long-term fit and exposure he would be having on a bigger role on a better team. For the Bulls, I mean, we always talk about how they need size, which they do, but they've got Vucevic and Drummond at the 5, and Pat, Will, and Torrey Craig at the 4. Where does Wood fit in at this point? And I've talked about this before. Yes, I do think there is a world where you can stagger minutes between Drummond and Christian Wood depending on the needs in a given game. You need scoring, more floor spacing. Obviously, you would play Wood at center behind Vucevic. You need more rebounding and interior presence against a bigger-bodied center. Then you're going with Andre Drummond. And at power forward, because Wood can play both, yeah, both Pat and Craig, you could slide them over to the 3 at various points in the game, particularly Torrey Craig because he's played small forward for a good portion of his career. And in that instance, you would have Wood come off the bench at the 4. So you could make it work. I just don't know if Wood could obtain as many minutes as he would otherwise get from a team like the Lakers. And if Wood is just riding the bench a lot with the Bulls because the rotation is more or less set, then for him it's like, well, great, I was able to get a couple more extra $1 million, but now my market value is even lower going into the following offseason, and now I'm going to have to settle for less as a result of it. Christian Wood is really going to be using this season as the ultimate contract year to bring his value back up and secure a big bag in free agency next season, assuming he signs a 1-year deal, which I think is going to be the most likely case. So all of this to say, I find it pretty unlikely that Christian Wood would actually sign with the Bulls, partially because the Bulls aren't going to be willing to go into the tax, and if they are able to make it work where they don't have to pay the tax, I don't think the role is going to be enticing enough for him to showcase himself as a player in a contract year. Those are just my thoughts though. I would love to hear what you guys think. How do you think Christian Wood would fit on the Bulls roster should they be able to obtain him? As always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.